We're live. Hello, friends. Welcome to the Be Waste Wise Pioneers and Changemakers interview series. It's 30-minute interviews every week. Every week we'll be learning from pioneers and changemakers around the world. And the topics we'll be discussing will be mostly in circular economy and waste management. And my name is Ranjit Annepu, co-founder of Be Waste Wise. And recently, we just have a few updates before we begin the interview. One of them is we signed a partnership with ISWA, the International Solid Waste Association, to make their deep expertise in waste management and their strong global network, to make these two aspects easily accessible to a global audience. We've signed this partnership, and the first webinar with ISWA will be on February 15th with Antonis Mavropoulos, and we also have another update. Our last week's panel with Adam Reed got rescheduled because Adam had a surgery and the recovery process wasn't going as quick as we wanted. We hoped for. So I'm sorry about that. And that panel is rescheduled to February 16th. That interview is rescheduled to February 16th. So most of you have registered for that. So please do join us on February 16th. And yeah, with that, we're good to go. So James, welcome to Be Waste Wise again.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you.
Great, wonderful. So James, we have just 30 minutes, so we'll be going through this really quickly. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing?
I guess I'm the head of BlindSpot think tank, which I set up about just over 10 years ago, to try to look beyond what the standard debates are around circular economy and around other really big global problems that typically we're not successful as a society at solving. So we go back decade after decade to the same problems, but with often the same solutions. And of course, the problems get worse. So I wanted to look at what we're missing, and I call that blind spotting. The blind spotting process brings in new perspectives, new ideas, and new kinds of solutions, typically at a bigger scale or a more ambitious scale than the standard debate and the standard conversation.
Right. Can you explain to us a little bit about the process of blind spotting and why that is probably and the importance of it in the overall change that happens in the world?
Definitely. I guess it ties to the nature of the problems that we face as a society, which are typically linked back, beyond the sort of obvious technical changes, the technical mistakes that we make. Like, we know that we throw away waste, we know that we are designing products badly. What is it that we keep missing? And that goes back to our habits of thinking. The habits of thinking, if you like, are the source of creating the problems. But then when we try to apply our thinking to the solutions, we typically will use the same habits of thinking and the same kind of consensus processes. So we feel reassured as a group when everybody agrees that a particular solution is the way forward. And
right.
Becomes a kind of a herd thinking process for solutions, rather than the stretching of the imagination or expanding the imaginative space until it really encompasses the scale of the problem. Typically, we do the opposite, which is what I call shrinking thinking. We try to look for the simplest, smallest, most obvious, most tangible thing that we can do, just to give ourselves a sense of hope and a sense of possibility that maybe somewhere, even to some small extent, something is going to get better. But of course, that's not enough.
Yeah. So is blind spotting, is it analogous to, let's say, the blind spot, the blind view mirror on the rear view mirrors in cars?
So yes, that, yes, if you like, exactly.
Not watching what's behind us. Is that analogous?
Being able to see into the blind spot, if you like, is a tool for survival.
Right.
in the same way as blind spotting is a tool for our collective survival. You know, if we want to keep going on this planet and to live the lives that we all aspire to, we need to be able to solve these big global problems, you know, of which waste and pollution and climate are you know, part of the package. But we've seen that over the we succeeded to solve them. And I'm not sure that we can even say that the solutions that we keep talking about as a society are actually even sufficient to encompass the problems.
Right.
So blind spotting is about taking the opposite assumption rather than just assuming doing is right on purpose, even if we don't quite believe it ourselves, and say, well, what is it that we're missing? How can we expand the imaginative space, and what are the bigger, more ambitious solutions that are out there?
Right, wonderful. And before this interview started, you showed me a picture of a bunch of sheep. Do you want to? Maybe our audience will.
Yes.
You know,
let's see if I can get that up there again. This is just to try to illustrate the need for blind spotting on waste and resources issues.
Right.
Because if you go back to the beginning of the circular economy idea, which is dated back to around 1965, and Kenneth Boulding, who described it as a spaceship economy. And at that point, 1965, the total material requirement of the global economy was around 23 billion tons. That was how much resources we needed. And, you know, some large proportion of that was being discarded every year. And at the beginning, when it started to be possible to think, well, let's not do that anymore. We won't need so many resources in future because we're going to look after them so well. We're not just going to throw them away and waste them and turn them into pollution in the air, land. And then in 1995, all the ideas of closed loop and cradle to cradle had been around. That's 30 years later. And all this time, every year, it's like as a society, we say, oh, well, we know what the right thing to do is, but actually we're not quite doing it yet. So please, could we have some more resources? Please, could we have another 23 billion? And by 1995, we were actually asking for double. We were asking for 45 billion tons extra resources every year from nature. You know, from the bank of the earth, if you like. We take a withdrawal and we say, well, we know what to do with all these resources. You know, just give us a bit more time and we'll work it out. 2015.
So are you calling Kenneth Boulding a sheep, or are you calling the society a sheep? I don't understand.
Well, you could say it's a bit like sheep thinking. As a society, we kind of follow each other around with this sort of sheep thinking or herd thinking. And we tell ourselves reassuringly that we have these visions like circular economy or closed loop, and kind of every 10 years we reinvent the language, and that gives us a sense that there's some kind of progress because we've got these new words for the same idea that we keep talking about every year. But actually what we keep doing in practice is doubling, you know, every few years. Now, typically, you know, between 95 and 2015, it was just 20 years. And we're now asking for more than 100 billion tons of resources from the Earth every year. A kind of a gap between the vision that we feel we're achieving and, you know, the serious need to actually achieve it in a very short time scale on a very big, ambitious level, like the whole economy. It's not enough just to be taught plastic straws or plastic bags or you know, plastic in the ocean or whatever it is we focus on. You know, we need to be doing it for the whole economy, and we need to be doing it. And I think that that's what's possible to do, using the ideas that are now available and using the ideas that have been published over the last 10 years or so.
Right. When we're talking about you know, reinventing the language, reinventing the concepts, don't you think the first time it was said, maybe by Kenneth Boulding, the amount of change or the amount of response was much different from the kind of response it gets now from different parts of the society? Don't you think that's progress? And also, don't you think the resistance to change that human societies have, what kind of role do you see for that overall? And how do you try to understand this reinventing in respect to with respect to the resistance to change, and also the kind of response that we get now as opposed to we probably got in when Kenneth Boulding first put this concept out.
Yes, it's really interesting to look at how the response has changed, because you're quite right that over the decades there are more people engaged with more initiatives. And you could say that now there are millions of people engaged with ecological or waste initiatives around the world. And that has to be a positive thing. On the other hand, we can see that that hasn't actually affected the total material requirements or the level of circularity in the economy or the kind of structural switch of the economy from a linear to a circular pattern. And so there's this kind of a gap between what we should be achieving, people who are working on it, and what we need to achieve. And it's useful also that you mentioned the resistance, because what's interesting there is you could say that the resistance is actually built into the way the system works. So the herd thinking is not just the habits of thinking that it's convenient to throw something away. The herd thinking and the resistance are built into the structure of the whole. So that, for example, when a business wants to design something which is visible, there are actually clear financial benefits quite often for that business in doing it. They can make something that becomes junk after a year, and then the customers have to throw it away and they have to come back. And if they're lucky, the business will get to sell the same thing again and again. And the poor old customer has to keep buying it again and again and then throwing it away because it was badly made in the first place. And that kind of resistance is still there. You can even say that there seems to be a kind of a matching resistance. You could say that the whole idea of Trump and the kind of anti-progressive movements that you see these days are a kind of anti-progressive movement that almost matches the progressive movement. So you can see the kind of a battle there where there's the fact that we still have linear economy built into the structure of economics allows a lot of people like Trump to think, oh, well, this is the way the world works and we just have to accept it. And look, this is good business, and business has always worked this way, and we've always burnt coal and we've always thrown things away. So, the kind of, it will seem to these people to make sense just because that's the way the world works. And so if you want to overcome the resistance, I don't think you can fight it directly. I think you need to actually reinvent the structure of the economics. You have to do it at a level where the resistance switches from thinking that that's the way the world works to suddenly realizing that the world is going to work a different way.
Right.
And starting to go with that way. And people like Trump, they might still be the dinosaurs of tomorrow, but then they'll be on their own and they'll be out of power and no one will be listening to them. So him will have as much of an audience as they deserve, which is almost no one. They should have the voice that they deserve. And I think it's our job as a movement of people who are thinking about these things to make that possible and to make it happen and to not delay anymore. We haven't got decades and decades to play with this anymore because the problems are so serious, waste and pollution and climate and so on.
Right. Here I just want to remind our audience viewers that so since you've understood the context in which James works, we're taking questions. So send us any questions that you have so that we can put them to James directly. But meanwhile, James, it's been 15 minutes since we started the discussion, so I think it's a good time to probably move on to the solutions part of the discussion, like in any other discussion. Can you talk about, what do you propose? What kind of solutions do you propose to this, like recycling that you mentioned during our conversation?
Yes, exactly. I mean, pre-cycling is a concept that actually came from America in the 1980s, invented by Maureen O'Rourke. Is that rather than waiting until something becomes waste, when the opportunities and the possibilities for changing it and preventing it from ending up as junk or pollution become increasingly limited. You do it beforehand, before some waste, and you get in particular the fantastic opportunities for redesigning for example, the product, redesigning the materials, the design, the collection system, the pricing, the finances of everything that you need to make sure that something doesn't become waste. And you can say that then that after you've done all that kind of work to make sure that the product that you're thinking about selling in future is not going to end up as waste in the land area. If you know it's going to become instead a new resource for people, you can say that that's pre-cycled. And actually, we could run the entire economy only on pre-cycled products. So the fuels could be pre-cycled, the shoes could be pre-cycled, the houses and the components of the houses and our clothes and our foods, all these things, all of them are products, and they could all be pre-cycled. And the action of pre-cycling, you could say, is actually the action of implementing the circular economy vision. So it's not enough just to have this fantastic vision in our minds and to go around talking about it at conferences and reassuring ourselves that this is a really good idea and waste is a really bad idea. Implemented in practice, and that's what pre-cycling is.
How do you implement pre-cycling on a scale that you want change at?
Yes. So it depends on who you are. If you're a shopper, then when you go shopping and there's a choice between products, say something is biodegradable and something else is non-biodegradable, or recyclable, non-recyclable, you can make those choices as a shopper. Or if you find something is breaking at home, I spend a lot of evenings doing this. You can sit at home and watch a bit of telly and repair it. So you can take things that would have ended up as being kind of pre-wasted and ending up as junk, and you can make sure that they instead will end up as new resources somewhere. Alternatively, if you're a business, you could be designing your products differently. You could be looking at your premises. You could be looking at the energy that you use. All these things can be pre-cycled. If you're a government, this is where it becomes really interesting. You can make sure by building it into the market economics, building it into the pricing, you can make sure that the entire economy of your country or nations or the European Union, for example, is going to be implementing pre-cycling routinely, rather than routinely allowing all kinds of products to end up as waste, like in the air or in the water or in the land.
Right. And James, we have a question, but from Nicholas. But before we go to the question, is pre-cycling similar to price on pollution or extended producer responsibility? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. Well, the usefulness of pre-cycling is that it's not just something that you can do as a consumer or as a household or as a government. It's not just something for a particular actor. You can use it to implement the circular economy idea within the structure of the economics. So you can use it as the basis for circular economics. And that's where it becomes interesting, because it becomes a way of pricing pollution, but in a kind of new and more efficient way. You're not pricing the cost of allowing the pollution to happen and then thinking, oh my God, we've got all this climate change now, who's going to pay the bill? So you don't wait until the problem is created and then becomes so big and so expensive that nobody actually can pay for it or even work out a solution. You pay for it preventively. The cost of doing the pre-cycling, which is linked to the cost of avoiding the waste risks, because every product has a risk of ending up as waste in ecosystems in the land, air, or water.
Right.
That cost can be built into the price of products very simply. For example, as an insurance on producers. So if you want to import a product, you want to make a product, then you would have to pay an insurance according to the proportion of the product, proportion of the risk that that product has of ending up as waste. So if it's a high waste risk product, like a junky product or something that, like a fossil fuel, it would pay a higher premium. And that would add to the cost of the product, and then the product would effectively be phased out in the market just by the pricing effect. You wouldn't even have to tell people about what a wonderful idea circular economy is and what a bad idea waste is. It would just be the prices that would do that automatically. So effectively, the same incentives that today cause products to end up as waste would be reversed. the same kind of mechanisms and incentives, the price incentives, would do the opposite thing and cause all the waste to be phased out.
Okay.
Just by normal market mechanisms.
All right. We had a question on the incentives from Nicholas, and I think you just mentioned that even before we asked the question. So well done, James. And so another question from Nicholas is, he agrees about the resistance factor. But James, do you think that putting forward alternative models like CE or pre-cycling and hoping and gaining momentum and support from the likes of Trump, not as a opposition but as a support, because he also has certain things that you could support the idea of circular economy pre-cycling. And do you think then such pivot points will crystallize change at the scale that you envision?
It's a good question. I mean, focusing on Trump, because he's like an extreme example of somebody who you might want to try to convince that circular economy is a good idea. And he's perhaps not the greatest intellect on the planet. So you would have to tie it into things that he already knows that he wants. So he already knows that he cares for his family, his kids and his grandkids. And so you could say, well, if you care for your family, then these are problems that you want to try to prevent and to stop and to reverse as quickly as possible, not to allow them to continue and to get worse.
Right, right. And
he also says that he cares for economic growth.
Actually, James, so there is generally a lot of talk about Trump, so maybe we shouldn't get into that too much, even in B-Waste wise. So let me, sorry, but let me ask you a much more better question again,
sure.
from which is, you have buy-in from business people when you go with the concept of circular economy, which is good. But what kind of, how do you get the same buy-in from decision makers, like in governments and politicians? Maybe you could respond to that. And then we have a question from Ad Lansing, which I'll put to you later on.
Yes, sure. Well, business people have an interest in seeing their business continue and in market share. So a lot of business people are positive about the concept of circular economy, but they're looking for ways to implement it. So you could say two things to them. You could say that it's useful to know what the waste risk of your product is, rather than just to be saying, oh, well, here's a nice design we could come up with, or let's just try to make biodegradable plastic bags, or let's just swap to paper. In order to make it more measurable and to make a more rigorous decision-making process, it's useful to look at what the waste risk of the various options are. And then you can link that to what the pre-cycling activities are. So you turn something which is a nice idea like circular economy into a practical series of process steps, like how to do it, which is about measuring waste risk, and which is about pre-cycling, thinking, what can we do to pre-cycle this particular product? And that's a way of bringing more people into the conversation, like not just the designers or not just the sustainability people, but you could have a conversation in the entire business like that. And it's the same with government people, because sometimes it's even a disadvantage for the policymakers who are typically experts in the sustainability policy opportunities. It's sometimes a disadvantage because they know too much about the way that this kind of problem is typically always solved. They get a little bit stuck in the standard solutions. So it can be useful to bring in some new language, to allow these people to engage in kind of simple terms with other people, other people in government, or to engage with business in this kind of dialogue, and to look beyond the standard policy solutions. One small example, in Britain, we talk a lot about, wouldn't it be nice to have a charge of, say, 20, 25p on a coffee cup, on a disposable coffee cup? And that's sort of the level of debate. What would be more useful, rather than waiting, years or decades or until 2040s to try to solve parts of these problems? We could say, well, why don't we talk about this in ways that can be applied to a lot of different products and throughout the whole economy, and to use the same kind of language that can be applied to coffee cups or to the coffee machine or to the building of the cafe.
Yeah.
And all of these things, you can talk about pre-cycling, what the waste risk is. And if you're really enthusiastic, if you're serious as a government, as a policymaker, you'll be thinking, well, how do we make this a producer responsibility? How do we build this into the pricing in a way that actually is beneficial to the business? And quite often will actually lead to a reduction in prices, because people are sometimes terrified initially about correcting externalities or correcting prices just because the price of something might go up.
Right.
But of course, when we're talking about looking after resources, what we're really talking about is the efficiency of that and how much better it is for the economy as a whole and for all market participants to look after the resources rather than to throw them away year after year,
Right.
and to somehow think that that's some kind of benefit.
Yeah, no. So we have another question from Ad Lansing. Ad Lansing, Be Waste Wise has called him the father of circular economy.
Yes.
He's a politician, a former politician from Netherlands, and
yes,
we also have
waste hierarchy guy.
Yes, yeah, and we also have 2 interviews on Be Waste Wise about him with him. So Ad's question is, I propose the preference order for waste management ladder of Lansing. I agree with Greyson regarding the resistance, both economical and political. So how can we overcome this resistance? That was the question. How do we overcome the resistance?
I think that the waste hierarchy is a fantastic tool, or the ladder of Lansing. You could call it another name for the same thing. The difficulty with has not been in the concept, which is very strong, but in the implementation among policymakers, because over the decades, the waste hierarchy has typically been talked about as a good thing, as a strategic policy measure at the basis of every strategy. But then, of course, when they come to implement it, they do it in the exact opposite, the reverse of what it should be. And so all the money and the energy and the intellectual effort goes into the wrong end of the waste hierarchy. It goes into incineration and disposal, and people think, oh, well, how can we have a bit less landfill and a bit more incineration? And of course, what we should be doing is looking at the opposite end, which is about prevention. And we don't need to focus on, well, we should just focus on trying and have more reuse, or we should have more recycling or whatever. So rather than focusing on a particular stage, it can be useful sometimes to say, well, there's a very simple binary choice with any product. It's either pre-cycled or it's not. If it's not, it's pre-wasted. So it doesn't matter whether your product is prevented or it's going to be reused or recycled, or if you're going to plant trees and allow it to become, say, landfill, a biogas, and then the gases are reabsorbed back into the trees that you're planting. It doesn't matter so much which of the options you choose. What matters is that that product is pre-cycled, and you know at the point that you sell it that that's going to be okay and taken care of. Suggestion.
All right. Thank you, James. I think we just have 2 minutes, so with this we'll have to end the call here. I have some concluding remarks, so those 2 minutes will be for me. And we have another question from Nicholas, but fortunately we'll not be able to take that. We'll send the question to you, and then we'll hopefully, send the response back to Nicholas. I just wanted to respond to Ad's question about how do we overcome the resistance. And this is something that I've seen. Resistance is not always bad, at least when we look at the timescales that humans evolve. These kind of resistance are this kind of resistance to a single idea helps us, not demolish ourselves sometimes. So, the resistance itself is not bad, but to be able to overcome that kind of resistance, I think, we need scale at which the idea can be implemented, and the scale at which people are thinking about this idea. I mean, most people, scientists and engineers like us, we don't really, we kind of go with the mindset that content is king, that if there is a very good idea, that everyone else will take up that idea. But we don't understand the aspect of scale and, business management part of it. So I think we should, get smarter and then focus on those issues. And one of the best ways to get through that resistance is through collective action. So that is also another thing that we should focus on to be able to make these ideas possible. So I think with that, we can end this. we can end this discussion here. We have some more questions, but yeah, so we can end this question here. James, I'll send you the questions, and thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Ranjish. A pleasure.
All right, wonderful.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Hopefully we'll stay in touch after this, yeah?
Yes, certainly.